Kant's concept, the concept of drive in Kant's third critique. That's the title. And the point is that there is obviously an expectation that it is clear that there must be something on drive in the third critique, since there seems to be an ostensible connection between teleology and drive in the third critique. And this is so, this might the expectation be because drive is a natural, sort of a natural property, one might think, of living beings in general, and this then is complemented in a sense by the concept of Zweck, and so it is clear as it looks that there is something, Kant says, on drive in the teleology. But actually there is no mention of Trieb in the teleology, surprisingly in a way, of course, except for the Bildungstrieb, as mentioned already in paragraph 81. But there are two references to Trieb in the aesthetics. The first one is in paragraph 41, the drive to society as presumably natural to human beings, and the second is in paragraph 60 in the Doctrine of Method, the vigorous or the drive towards the lawful sociability. So it seems to be clear then that for Kant the meaning of drive in the third critique is predominantly practical or moral. And maybe I should say drive and its cognates. Yeah? This is one thing we probably would agree on, that the terminology is not at all clear. Certainly not in Kant, but I guess also not in in pre-Kantian, say, rational psychology, for example. Maybe it helps in order to understand why drive appears here to just look at the context of paragraph 41, the aesthetics. So the context there is the sensus communis and the universal communicability, and in paragraph 60 it's humanity as the universal feeling of participation, Kant says, and again communicability. And this, one might think, this has sort of a practical, maybe not a moral, but there's sort of a practical flavor here. But maybe this doesn't explain a lot in the end. So I think at least two questions arise here. Many questions, but two questions I think that are obvious to ask. The first one is, why is drive not mentioned in the teleology? Yeah, so that there must be a reason, since it's so natural. And the second is, what is the practical or moral meaning of drive here in the third critique, and what is its systematic place in the third critique? And in what follows, I argue for two claims. The first claim is that, well, there is, in fact, a discussion of drive in the teleology, although only an implicit discussion. And this discussion takes place in the context of the doctrine of the ultimate end of nature. And my second claim is that the systematic connection between drive and teleology in the third critique, and not only there, but predominantly in the third critique, is Kant's philosophy of history and his philosophy of culture. This is the outline then of my talk. I think it is important to take into account, in order to really understand why the drive to society is so important for Kant, to take into account also the historical background, so to speak, of the doctrine, the concept of the drive to society. This is what I'm going to do in the first section. In the second section, then, I try to motivate the idea that philosophy of history and culture is the binding idea of Kant's understanding of drive and purposiveness in the third critique. And then I have some concluding remarks. So the first section, the drive to society, just a few remarks on the historical background. What I should say at the start is, and I can recommend this paper, and I think some of you have read this paper. This is at least this is my impression, since Stefanie Buchner has worked out in a paper from 2002 all the historical background. It's a brilliant paper. She also mentions that Baumgarten is the one who introduced Triebfeder, or who meant to mention it for the first time, and motif. She works out the sources on Reimarus, Thomasius, and all the others. This is really brilliant, a brilliant paper. And so I owe quite a lot here to that paper. But anyway, just a few remarks. I start with a reminder, if you like, of the religion from 1794, where Kant presents a classification of the three original predispositions to good in human nature. And this classification is around all over the place in Kant. Maybe not explicitly, but often implicitly. The classification is, one, the predisposition to animality, which is purely physical self-love. The second is the predisposition to humanity, which is rational self-love. And the third is the predisposition to personality, which covers the moral dimension, so moral respect or reverence for the law. Yeah, and maybe this connects well with what Manja Kistner just presented. Anyway, the interesting point now is that there is that there's a subdivision of the first predisposition, which is the following. So the first predisposition, which is animality, pure physical, sometimes Kant says even mechanical self-love, which is self-preservation, Kant says, propagation through the sex drive, and then thirdly, community with others through the drive to society. Kant does not, at least not explicitly, say that self-preservation is a drive, but I guess he would agree that if we'd ask him, do you think this is a drive? I guess he would say yes. So there are three drives he distinguishes here. So clearly then, in the critique of judgment and in the religion, Kant thinks that the drive to society is a merely physical and or mechanical disposition, purely physical or mechanical. And he basically says the same thing in The Idea from 1784. To enter into society, that's proposition 4, is just a natural propensity, he says there. Now, in order, as I said, to shed some light on Kant's use of drive to society, it's really interesting to just look back into the history of this formula, this term, drive to society, in 17th and 18th century psychology. And this means Thomasius, Rüdiger, Wolf, Baumgarten, Crusius, and I could mention more, but this is actually worked out in much more detail by Stefanie Buchner. So interesting is that Thomasius, who seemed to be the first one to teach philosophy in German. I don't know whether this is substantiated really. It's always difficult in terms of history of philosophy to say he or she is the first one. Who knows? But say it as it looks like. He seems to be the first one, and so he seems to be the first one to, at least in philosophy, introduce these classical terms like drive. So Thomasius clearly makes a practical use of drive, Trieb, in terms of will and mental power in general. He also uses Kraft, as all the others, and later on, Kraft, Grundkraft, even Kant, later on, Grundkraft. And he does that. This is what you can check easily. It's all digitalized, so you can just read this stuff online in the Einleitung zur Sittenlehre and also in the Ausübung zur Sittenlehre. Now, what is important, I think, is to see that according to Thomasius, Trieb cannot be reduced to reason. This is, I think, really important. And this is true for, that's the distinction he makes, Thomasius already, of Liebestrieb and Gesellschaftstrieb. So drive to love and drive to society. This is also interesting, since in the history of the concept trieb and in the history of the use of the concept, this is very often discussed in connections of the drive to society, in connection with the drive to love. But I focus here on the drive to society. This is what Thomasius says in die Ausübung zur Sittenlehre. Erkennet, der Mensch, der Philosoph, dass es Gott so haben wolle und ihm deshalb einen Trieb gegeben, dass er in anderen Menschen mehr als in sich selbst zu leben verlanget. So this is a strange wording, even in German. So mehr als in sich selbst zu leben verlangt. So this sounds like sex drive. So no, this is not what he means. This is the standard formula for just social drive. Yeah? This is the way they formulate it. So, but what is important? It's God. Yeah? God has willed it. So then Thomasius, and in particular his student Rüdiger, for them the drive to society is natural and cannot be rationalized. It is implanted by God, of course, yeah, but it is natural, depends on God, but it cannot be rationalized. That's really important. We'd find the same story in Baumgarten and Wolff. Okay, there are differences, but basically there's the same idea. There seems to be a heavy influence. So the drive to society involved in Baumgarten also is non-rational, purely natural, and even mechanical. Another interesting background here is, mentioned already by the previous speakers, is Crusius. Crusius seems to be important here, especially for Kant, since Crusius, in his Anweisung, paragraph 122, says on the drive to society is one of the foundational drives. And the quote is, das Verlangen nach der Vereinigung mit solchen Objekten, in welchen wir Vollkommenheit wahrnehmen. So this again sounds strange. Object, what does he mean? Well, of course, human beings. Yeah? So an object that is perfect, or that can that is subject to perfectly develop its cognitive capacities, for example, moral capacities, is the human being. This also is important because Kant seems to make, without mentioning later on Crusius, certain references to this view of Crusius. So I could continue, but I just recommend you to read this article by Buchenau, since she gives all the details, all the sources. But what is really important is to see that this is a natural drive, it cannot be rationalized, and it stems from God. Yeah? It depends on God. This is the case in Thomasius, who seems to have introduced Trieb, or has used it for the first time. And this is also the case in Rüdiger, Baumgarten, Wolff, Crusius, and so on. But I should say that this is, of course, only one way to spell out this background. I could have also turned to that background history, although this would not have worked out, I think. This is just my claim, and it would require quite some time to show this. But one simple reason is that they do not use drive. You won't find drive there. Because I didn't find it. It's desire, and so on. That's what you're going to find in Pufendorf, Grotius, Pufendorf, Hobbes, Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, you could add, and even Rousseau belongs here. Yeah? So this is would be a totally different story to tell. Anyway, so on the backdrop of of this, then my second section here in my talk, which is the main section, is so that obviously there's a link in Kant between drive to society and purposiveness. And the question is now, how does Kant argue for this link? And what does this link actually, or the term drive to society mean in Kant? So if we look into the idea, again, proposition 4, Kant says the human being has an inclination, so he says propensity, inclination. Okay, so I think he's not really clear about the terminology here. So inclination to become socialized, since in such a condition he feels himself as more a human being, i.e. feels the development of his natural predispositions. So here clearly the drive to society, the inclination is natural, already in 1784. Again, just the same thing in the critique of judgment, the third critique, paragraph 41, paragraph 60. The natural drive or the drive to society and sociability is a natural drive. Now, I think Kant has really a very specific argument in mind now in order to show why this is the case and what consequences this has. And what I'm going to do now on the next few slides is to reconstruct this argument. And we would need to start from the first three propositions of the idea, 1784, where Kant says, so according to the teleological doctrine of nature, and there he says simply, I presuppose it here, it's presupposed. He does not say anything else. He does not mention where he got it from, what it means. What is also interesting is that he seems to have copy-pasted stuff from the idea into the critique of judgment, because they're literally the same. They're literally the same in paragraph 81, 82 and 83, as we will see. Anyway, so that's the presupposition, the teleological doctrine of nature. All natural predispositions of a creature and are determined sometime to develop themselves completely and purposively. What is important now is that he conceives of this in terms of development. And not only that, he emphasizes that this complete development is only in the species, but not in the individual. And this has really fundamental consequences, or is at least an indication of what Kant thinks our cognitive capacities look like, and what he thinks we can't and should not do with it. If you just think of the Basedow pedagogy that he supported, that he was very much in favor of, since Basedow was the first one to present sort of an alternative kind of pedagogy and way of educating young adults or kids in order to get away from this sort of pietist way of very strict education and to develop a free way of, or to allow for free development of cognitive capacities and so on. I'm just mentioning this, and this is, I think, somewhat the background here. So the picture is that we need development. Cognitive capacities in general need to develop, and we cannot just start from sort of a preformed something and then just wait until it grows. So species and the individual. And then the question is, if that is the case, if there's development, what does that development need to look like? And he then says, well, the means nature employs, because it's nature that does the job here, the means that nature employs in order to bring about the development of all their predispositions is the antagonism in society. This comes nicely out in various quotes where Kant says things like, nature has willed it, and thanks be to nature for social conflict, disagreement, and even war. He says that also in the Metaphysics of Morals later on, as we know. Why? Well, quote from the idea, proposition 4, For without them, all the excellent natural predispositions in humanity would eternally slumber undeveloped. The human being wills concord, but nature knows better what is good for the species, not for the individual, for the species. It wills discord. So clearly, the natural drive to society is then the cause for social development, and as we will see later on, the cause for other things too, and condition of the development of the natural dispositions. So there seems to be already in the idea a teleology of drive at work, Kant thinks, and naturally he then of course needs to say something about nature's plan in more detail. So nature's plan, namely to bring about, to promote the social condition of human development under which the complete development of the predispositions can take place. But the teleology of drive is only alluded to in the idea, and is, I think, made much more explicit by Kant in the third critique. And this is what I'm going to turn to now. So that's the third critique then, that has, or starts off again with the teleological development of history because of nature's plan. History must have a plan, or nature must have a plan with respect to historical development. So, just a few words on what Kant thinks philosophy of history is and what it has to do with teleology, because it's sort of surprising how does philosophy of history fit in here. I think this is not my interpretation, and you might later on in the Q&A let me know whether you think this is too much or maybe not enough even. So philosophy of history for Kant is about understanding causal connections between actions. Because if you start reading the idea, he already says so. There are appearances, actions are appearances, and there are appearances of the free will, and then the thing goes on. History should then, and this is my wording of it, be conceived as an organic whole in order to make it possible to then apply the principle of reflective judgment, so objective purposiveness. What does this mean? So, and why is this necessary? This is necessary, as Kant already says in the idea, because history should not be conceived as an aggregation of actions. It's not an aggregate. It's not an adding up of actions. History is, in that sense, and I borrow this from Kant's theoretical philosophy, is not a compositum reale, something that is just put together and can be put apart. It's not a compositum reale, but history is, as Kant sees it, a compositum ideale, an organic whole, which simply means that it must be presupposed as a whole in order then to place or locate the actions in it. Yeah? And this is just in analogy to the concept, the idea of an organized being. This is how teleology comes in. Then the question, of course, is that if that is so, what then is the end? Does history have an end? Yeah? And in a way, surprisingly, Kant says, you might expect, no, he would never say any such thing. No, yeah, he says something along these lines. Yes, the end is the complete and purposeful development of all natural dispositions. Now, how is that development made possible? Kant's answer is, of course, the drive to society, which is more concretely now civil society, so a lawful society, which, and I have bracketed this because he expands this, of course, to the union of civil societies on the cosmopolitan level. Yeah, but I won't leave that. I will leave this and won't get into that in detail. So the lawful international federation of states. So Kant is the one to introduce the concept of federalism. Yeah, this has not been used before, federalism. Now, what he has in mind, I think, can really be seen in his doctrine of the ultimate end. In paragraph 81, Kant mentions Bildungstrieb. He not even discusses it, but okay, he sort of circumscribes it, and then he leaves it aside. He doesn't mention it again. In paragraph 82, 83, where he spells out the doctrine of the ultimate end, he does not use Trieb either, but it is clear that it is that he has in mind. So, to start with, he says in paragraph 82 that there is surprisingly now not only internal or immanent purposiveness, but that there is external purposiveness. This is now an external purposiveness. What does this mean? That's his definition. One thing in nature serves another as the means to an end. Okay, so just accept this for the sake of argument. Yeah? If we accept it, then, as it looks like, Kant argues, we have a system of natural ends which requires, quasi-Aristotelian, which requires a final end. So, this is not about letzter Zweck, so ultimate end. This is now about, or this is the reference to the Endzweck. But this is not the issue here, Kant says. Yeah? So, not yet. What I need to get my hands on is the meaning of ultimate end. Why? Well, because clearly the final end is beyond nature. And this is what I'm not interested in right now. I am interested only in the ultimate end, which is in nature. Now, again, surprisingly, Kant says, what is the ultimate end in nature? It is the human being. Why is this so? Well, because the human being, he thinks, is the only being that has the potential to set purposes and to choose the means for ends. There are no other beings in nature that have that potential. And you might not know, but there are these experiments with apes and so on and so on. Okay, yeah, but on a higher level, I think we might agree with Kant. If we accept that too, then in the next step is that the relation among organized beings in nature is purposeful. So just on from an external perspective, this only refers to external purposiveness. But this is, and just to remind you of, not objectively so, but this is only so for the human species, so for reflective judgment. This is only so, of course, for reflective judgment. Now, the crucial point is that Kant then thinks, and I think convincingly, that what we need to do now is to determine the relation between the human being, which is the end, the ultimate end in nature, and nature itself. What is that relation? And now Kant is proposing an argument that starts off from a disjunction. He thinks there are only two candidates, really, that could answer this question, or could spell out and determine what this relation is. And the first one is, the first option really we have is nature serves as means and promotes happiness. What Kant has in mind is here just the humans could just explore nature, and by exploring it, this is what we are doing right now, I guess, and this what the discussion is going on right now, is just aiming for happiness. Yeah? Nature serves individual humans, or even on a species level, happiness. The second, and that's crucial now, the second option we have is that nature is to be conceived as the aptitude and skill for all sorts of ends. And this is culture. Now, why does he think this is disjunct? Could we just, go for happiness? No, because happiness is the ultimate end in just material respect. And this is, again, we know this from the groundwork already and other writings. Kant is not so much for happiness as a moral principle, and so on and so on. And he gives similar arguments here in this context, but more importantly, it is a material end, but the alternative would then be the formal end. So we have just these disjuncts, formal and material. Material doesn't work, so it must be formal. The formal end the ultimate end of nature as a formal end is the production of the aptitude of a rational being for any ends in general, thus of his freedom, he says. And this is, as I said, culture. Well, as Kant says, culture. Why is this so? Because, culture means simply for Kant that the human being produces the natural means he or she needs in order to achieve his ends or her ends. Yeah? And this is fundamentally different from just exploring nature. We can just explore it and that's fine, we're going to be happy. This doesn't work. Yeah? An ultimate end can only be a formal ultimate end. So this aptitude then for producing means requires, just recall proposition 4 from the idea, development. This is not just there. Yeah? We are not born with these capacities, with these skills. We need to develop them, we need to be educated in order to completely develop them in the course of history on the species level. So the aptitude for producing means requires development of natural predispositions throughout the history of the human species. And you might think, so now that's the end of the story. The argument is really complicated, I think. And I've already left out many things, many details. But I hope at least it's the ground structure or so is clear. But this is not yet the end. And you might think, oh, now we have it. It's the form, it's culture. No, the point now is that this wouldn't get us very far. What we need is just the idea that development is only possible by means of inequality among citizens or people. This is exactly the idea of the social drive, so the drive to society that creates conflict, disagreement. Well, why? Well, because we do have different kinds of talents, and this has midterm or even long-term or even short-term the result of fundamental disagreement, war, fights, and so on. And all this contributes, the dissimilarity of individual capacities to conflicts, that causes conflicts, and these natural conflicts promote the progress of culture, and then the formal condition for this complete development of the natural disposition then is the civil society. And now he's, via the doctrine of the ultimate end, he gets back to what he already said in 1784, although here made much more explicit within the teleology. So nature's means then to realize civil society, and this is always what needs to be added, the cosmopolitan whole, since this is exactly the same story it tells in the doctrine of in the faculties, in the metaphysics of morals, and in the perpetual peace, and so on. So nature's means to realize civil society then is, again, the drive to society plus antagonism. That's the argument. And that's my concluding remark. Just a few. So, again, so we have the drive to society as a merely natural disposition. This is from where I started. It is clearly so that it is not God, but nature that wills it so. And this is, I guess, really directed against this tradition of Thomasius and others. In the idea, he starts off with the view that the complete development of the dispositions, the natural predispositions, is sort of an analytic truth. If there is teleology of nature, and if there are natural dispositions, then these natural dispositions must be developed completely. Otherwise, this would be contradictory. Who is promoting this development? Well, the drive to society. The drive to society and the social condition, finally, and again, the lawful civil society as nature's plan. Maybe one should not misconceive Kant here. So he's not claiming that nature is an acting factor here. It sounds like, but this is not what he is saying. It's not a hypothesization of nature as such. Maybe we can get back to that in the discussion. So nature's means then is exactly that, this conflict antagonism that creates culture, and from there we can move on to a full-fledged model, I'd say, and I think what Kant has in mind is this drive to society, one might call it model, that is to be conceived as non-temporal. Yeah? So it's a non-temporal conception of history, of course, that I think looks like this. Cultivation. From cultivation, we move on to moralization. From moralization, we move on to civilization. And from civilization, I've said, I didn't go into detail, federalization. And again, this is not a temporal sequence. It's not a temporal series. It's an idealized view of how nature comes to terms with the complete development of natural dispositions via the drive to society, and then following these, well, in a non-temporal sense, following these 4 steps. I think this is what is. Someone who has, maybe I should mention this, and I owe something to the article by Günther Zöller, Kant's political anthropology from the Kant yearbook, that is much more detailed and has similar points to make. If you want to get really into many more references, you can turn to that one. So, and just now to stop, is this just pure speculation? Yeah? Is this over the top? Since it's really complicated and it takes some time. If you read 81, 82, 83, and I'm not speaking of those paragraphs that follow, but only those few paragraphs I think are really difficult and challenging. And you might think, yeah, this is something that sounds or looks like a metaphysical novel. This is what Hegel says. Leibniz philosophy, it's a metaphysischer Roman. Kant actually says a similar thing about Leibniz, as we know. So this is not very friendly. And this is, of course, not true. It's metaphysical, but it's not a novel, I think. So, yeah, is this drive to society model another novel in that sense? Yeah? Is this something that overcomplicates things? There could be many more questions could be asked, but I think no. Well, maybe this is not an appropriate answer in a way, but I think it foreshadows really what is still to come. And this is the German idealist understanding of history in exactly this developmental way of psychological capacities that we have in the pre-Kantian philosophy, certainly, and that Kant criticizes a lot, and that Kant tries to, for the first time, I think, to spell out in a completely different way, and that is then continued in German idealism, which means not just referring back to God and then make a list of, the kinds of cognitive capacities we have, maybe by self-observation, and not systematizing them. This is really Kant's ambition, to have shown this, that is not possible. We can only isolate understanding and sensibility. Full stop, that's it. Only isolate, we cannot deduce them. If this is an acceptable view, that's another story, but this is certainly different from the view that God has implanted these capacities in the human mind or soul. But this really is something foreshadowing that is then completed, I think, or completed if you think that is the end of it, but that really is carried out in much more detail and breadth in German idealism by Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, and something that I think is still totally understudied, the idealist history of self-consciousness. In Fichte, certainly, so the early Fichte, Schelling, system of transcendental idealism, and Kant, and Hegel, Kant is not a German idealist, and Hegel, the phenomenology of spirit, where you have exactly the idea. In Fichte, cognitive capacities. In Schelling, cognitive capacities plus nature, and then in Hegel, truth claims. Yeah? The stepladder of truth claims, the history of self-consciousness, the Bildung des Bewusstseins selbst zur Wissenschaft. I'm absolutely sure that the Bildung there is somehow related to that tradition. Bildungstrieb, Trieb, Bildung, drive. If you look into the text, then you're going to find again the use of these terms. Thank you.